The wind carries the scent of salt and fear across the eastern shores of England. The year is 865. Dawn breaks over a landscape soon to be forever changed. A Saxon sentry stands atop a coastal bluff, his eyes narrowed against the morning mist. Then he sees them, dragon-headed prows emerging from the fog like creatures from another world. The shields that line their gunwales are not mere protection. They are the harbingers of a new age of warfare. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now let's begin. The England that awaited these Northmen was a patchwork of kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, each with their own traditions of warfare that had served them for generations. The Anglo-Saxons were no strangers to battle. Their society was built upon the foundations of warrior culture, where a lord's power was measured by the strength of his hearth warriors, men bound to him by oaths of loyalty and gifts of gold armrings. Their fighting style was formidable but predictable. Shield walls would meet, spears would thrust, and men would die in the crush of bodies and metal. But far to the north, beyond the wild seas, a different way of life had taken shape. In the fjords and mountains of Scandinavia, the men and women of the north lived in a world defined by harsh winters and brief, precious summers. Their settlements clung to narrow strips of fertile land between the mountains and the sea. Here, in long communal halls, with smoke-blackened rafters, the foundations of Viking society took form. Children grew up hearing tales of their ancestors, of gods who rode across the sky, and giants who dwelled in the mountains. They learned that a person's worth was measured not just in wealth, but in courage, strength, and cunning. The shield was central to this way of life, not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of status and protection. From a young age, Norse children would practice with wooden shields, learning to move, block, and strike as one unified body. By the time a boy reached manhood, the shield had become an extension of himself. Each warrior's shield told a story, painted with symbols of their clan, adorned with metal bosses that caught the light of the sun, and rimmed with iron to withstand the blows of enemies. The creation of these shields was a craft perfected over generations. Unlike the heavier, more cumbersome shields of their contemporaries, the Viking round shield was a marvel of practical engineering. Crafted from overlapping planks of lightweight linden or pine wood, these shields typically measured between 75 and 90 centimeters in diameter. The construction was ingenious, thin enough to be maneuverable, yet strong enough to absorb the impact of spears and axes. At the center sat the shield boss, a dome of iron that protected the hand and could be used as a weapon in close combat. The wood for these shields was carefully selected and prepared. Linden, or lime wood, was particularly prized for its combination of lightness and strength. The trees were felled in winter when the sap was low. Then the trunks were split along the grain rather than sawn, preserving the natural strength of the wood fibers. The planks were shaped by skilled hands, planed down to a thickness of only about a centimeter, sometimes even thinner toward the edges. These thin planks were then layered and glued together, with the grain running in different directions to prevent splitting. The outer face would often be covered with leather or linen, painted with designs that identified the warrior or invoked the protection of the gods. But it was not just the design that set the Viking shield apart, it was how they were used. The Norse warriors had developed a system of shield manipulation that would transform the battlefields of Europe. Rather than merely absorbing blows, they learned to actively parry, to redirect the force of an enemy's weapon, to create openings where none seemed to exist. The shield was no passive defense, but an active component of their fighting style. In the training fields of Scandinavia, young warriors learned to feel the rhythm of combat, to anticipate the movements of their opponents, to read the subtle shifts of weight and intention that preceded an attack. They practiced in pairs and in groups, honing their reflexes until the shield seemed to move of its own accord, intercepting threats before the conscious mind had fully registered them. This intuitive understanding of combat dynamics would prove devastating against opponents trained in more rigid, formalized fighting styles. As winter's grip loosened on the fjords of Scandinavia in the mid-9th century, a profound restlessness began to stir among the Norse people. The causes of Viking expansion were many: population growth, internal conflicts, and the lure of wealth abroad all played their part. But perhaps most significant was the changing political landscape of Scandinavia itself. As smaller kingdoms consolidated into larger ones, many found themselves dispossessed or in opposition to the new order. For these men, the sea offered both escape and opportunity. Climate change may have also played a role in this great movement of peoples. Studies of ice cores and tree rings suggest that the Northern Hemisphere experienced an unusually warm period from about 800 to 1300 CE, now known as the Medieval Warm Period. For the Norse, this meant longer growing seasons and the possibility of farming in previously marginal lands like Greenland and Iceland. But it also meant increased population pressure on the limited arable land of Scandinavia, pushing younger sons and landless men to seek fortunes elsewhere. The vessels that carried them across the North Sea were as revolutionary as the warriors themselves. The long ship, with its shallow draft, symmetrical design, and remarkable balance of strength and flexibility, could navigate both open seas and narrow rivers. They could beach directly on shorelines, allowing Viking warriors to strike without warning and withdraw before local forces could mobilize. And lining the gunwales of these ships, visible from afar, were the shields of the crew, a display of strength and a practical protection against the elements. These ships represented the pinnacle of Northern European naval technology, the culmination of centuries of maritime experience. Each was built by master craftsmen who understood the behavior of wood and water with an almost mystical intuition. The keel was laid from a single massive oak trunk, carefully selected for its shape and grain. The strakes, the planks forming the hull, were split rather than sawn, preserving the natural strength of the wood fibers. They were attached to the keel and to each other using the lapstrake or clinker method, where each plank overlapped the one below it, creating a strong yet flexible structure that could flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. The rigging was equally innovative. A single square sail made of wool or linen provided the main propulsion when the wind was favorable. But unlike many contemporary vessels, the Viking longship could also be rowed efficiently, with oar ports designed to allow for maximum power with minimum water ingress. This dual capability meant that Norse raiders could approach under sail to conserve energy, then switch to oars for the final approach, achieving speeds that seemed supernatural to those watching from shore. The Vikings' first significant contact with England came in 793, when raiders struck the holy island of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "In this year, dire portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. There were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine followed these signs, and shortly after that, on 8th of June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne." Alcuin of York, a prominent Anglo-Saxon scholar serving at the court of Charlemagne, wrote in response to the Lindisfarne raid, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Behold, the church of St. Truer, Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." The shock of this attack reverberated through Christian Europe, signaling the beginning of an age of Viking expansion that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of the continent. This raid shocked Christian Europe, not merely for its violence, but for its target, a sacred center of learning and faith. Yet what truly terrified the Anglo-Saxons was the speed and precision with which these strangers fought. When the shield walls met, something unexpected happened. The Viking shields did not merely stand firm, they moved with purpose. Where Saxon spears thrust forward, Viking shields turned them aside. Where Saxon warriors expected resistance, they found their weapons deflected, their balance compromised, their formations broken. The initial encounters between Viking raiders and Anglo-Saxon defenders revealed a stark contrast in combat methodologies. The Saxons relied heavily on the traditional shield wall, a formation where warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. Behind this wall, spearmen would thrust at the enemy while protected by their comrades' shields. It was a strategy that had served them well in conflicts with their neighbors. But the Vikings brought something new to these encounters, a dynamic approach to shield work that confounded their opponents. While they too could form a shield wall when necessary, Norse warriors were trained to use their shields actively and individually. When a Saxon spear thrust forward, a Viking shield would not just block it, but would sweep it aside, creating an opening for a devastating counterstrike. This technique, known as the shield bind in modern reenactment circles, effectively neutralized the primary advantage of the Saxon spear, its reach. The Viking approach to combat was not just technically different, but philosophically distinct. Saxon warfare, influenced by centuries of Roman military tradition, emphasized discipline, formation, and collective action. The individual warrior was part of a greater whole, his personal prowess subordinated to the needs of the unit. Viking combat, while certainly capable of coordinated action, placed greater emphasis on individual skill and initiative. Each warrior was expected to be a self-contained fighting unit, able to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances without direction from above. This difference reflected the broader social structures of the two cultures. Saxon England, with its established kingdoms, churches, and manorial system, had developed hierarchical military organizations where authority flowed from the king through ealdormen and thanes to the common soldiers. Norse society, still more tribal and egalitarian despite growing centralization, produced warriors accustomed to greater autonomy on and off the battlefield. As word of these strange warriors and their fighting techniques spread across the Saxon kingdoms, fear took root. Local lords found themselves unprepared for this new threat from the sea. The Vikings did not fight according to the unwritten rules of Anglo-Saxon warfare. They did not announce their intentions with formal declarations or gather armies on open fields. They struck from the water, they fought with unexpected tactics, and they withdrew before a proper response could be mounted. In the early years of Viking activity in England, most raids followed a similar pattern. Longships would appear suddenly, often targeting coastal monasteries and settlements that combined wealth with limited defenses. The raiders would secure their ships, form a disciplined fighting unit, and move quickly to their objective. If opposed, they would deploy their shield techniques to devastating effect. If not, they would secure whatever portable wealth they could carry, gold, silver, precious relics, and slaves, before returning to their ships and disappearing over the horizon. The psychological impact of these early raids cannot be overstated. The Vikings quickly gained a reputation for ferocity and unpredictability that often preceded them. Rumors and tales of their shield techniques and battle prowess grew with each telling. It was said that their shields could turn aside any weapon, that they fought with a frenzy inspired by their pagan gods, that they felt no fear or pain in battle. While much of this was exaggeration, such stories served the Vikings well, sometimes leading to surrender without resistance. The Christian chroniclers of the time contributed to this fearsome reputation, portraying the Norse raiders as divine punishment for the sins of the people. The language used to describe them, heathen men, ravages, a pagan race, emphasized their otherness, casting them as something beyond normal human adversaries. This framing served the interests of the Church, which could use the Viking threat to encourage greater piety and obedience, but it also inadvertently enhanced the psychological advantage the raiders already enjoyed. By the mid-860s, what had once been mere raiding parties transformed into something far more threatening: the great heathen army. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, according to later sagas, this force was not content with raiding and returning home. They came to conquer and to settle, and as they moved inland from their beachheads, the Anglo-Saxons would learn just how devastating Viking shield techniques could be on the larger battlefield. The Great Heathen Army, as it was called in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, represented a significant evolution in Viking activity in England. Rather than seasonal raiders returning to Scandinavia with their plunder, this was a substantial military force with political ambitions. Estimates of its size vary widely, from a few hundred to several thousand warriors. But whatever its actual numbers, it was large enough to defeat the forces of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in succession. The composition of this army reflected the diverse origins of the Viking phenomenon. It included warriors from what are now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, each bringing slightly different fighting traditions and equipment. Some may have been professional soldiers, veterans of conflicts in Scandinavia, or mercenary service abroad. Others were likely farmers and craftsmen who had taken up arms in search of land and wealth. But all shared a common training in the shield techniques that had proven so effective against European opponents. The Battle of York in 866 demonstrated the full potential of Viking combat methods. As the Northumbrian forces formed their traditional shield wall outside the city walls, the Vikings appeared to do the same. But as the battle joined, the Norse shield wall became fluid, sections advancing and retreating in coordination. Where Saxon warriors thrust their spears, Viking shields redirected them, creating gaps that were immediately exploited. The coordination required for such maneuvers spoke to years of practice and a deep understanding of battlefield dynamics. The Vikings' approach to the battle demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. Rather than simply meeting the Saxon shield wall head-on, they employed a range of maneuvers to disrupt and fragment it. Some accounts suggest they used a formation known as the Svin-Fylking, or swine array, a wedge-shaped formation designed to split enemy lines. Others indicate they feigned retreat to draw portions of the Saxon forces out of formation before counterattacking. But central to all these tactics was the skilled use of their shields, not merely for protection, but as active components of their offensive strategy. The fall of York was significant beyond the immediate military victory. Northumbria had been one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and a center of learning and culture in northern Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, Bede's ecclesiastical history, and other treasures of early medieval scholarship had emerged from Northumbrian monasteries. Now its capital was in Viking hands, a stark demonstration that nowhere in England was beyond their reach. The aftermath of York sent shockwaves through the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, once a powerful realm and center of learning, had fallen to the pagan invaders. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler and began to establish themselves in the region. This was no longer a matter of coastal raids, but the potential collapse of Anglo-Saxon England itself. The year after York's fall, the Great Heathen Army turned south to East Anglia. King Edmund faced them in battle but was defeated, and, according to later hagiographies, executed when he refused to renounce his Christian faith. East Anglia too came under Viking control. Then came Mercia, where King Burgerid was forced to pay tribute to the invaders. By 870, only Wessex remained as an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and it too faced the Viking threat. As the Great Heathen Army turned its attention southward, the remaining Saxon kingdoms scrambled to adapt. Reports from survivors of York and other encounters provided valuable insights into Viking fighting methods. Saxon warriors began to modify their own shield techniques, learning to anticipate the sweeping parries and counter-movements of their Norse opponents. Shields were redesigned to be lighter and more maneuverable, though they never quite matched the versatility of the Viking rounds. The adaptation process was accelerated by the presence of Saxon warriors who had survived encounters with Viking forces and could provide first-hand accounts of their techniques. Some of these men had observed the Norse shield methods from the receiving end and could demonstrate the movements to their comrades. Others had been taken captive and later ransomed or escaped, bringing with them a deeper understanding of Viking combat approaches. A few may even have fought alongside Norse warriors as mercenaries or allies, gaining direct experience with their fighting style. The introduction of the Viking shield techniques forced a rapid evolution in Anglo-Saxon military thinking. Traditional formations and tactics had to be reconsidered and modified. Warriors who had spent their lives mastering one style of combat now had to learn another or perish. This period of adaptation was painful and costly, marked by defeats and setbacks. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals changes in Anglo-Saxon weapons and armor that reflected this adaptation process. Spearheads became heavier and more angular, designed to penetrate or hook shields rather than simply thrust past them. Axes, previously less common in Saxon warfare, became more prevalent, their heavy heads better able to overwhelm a parrying shield than a spear thrust. Sword designs evolved as well, with some adopting features of Norse weapons that had proven effective against shields. The changes extended beyond equipment to training methods. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle rarely discusses the details of military preparation, but later sources indicate that shield use became more dynamic in the period following the initial Viking incursions. The Saxon warrior ideal, previously focused on standing firm in the shield wall, began to incorporate elements of the more mobile, active defense that had proven so effective against them. But humans are adaptable, and necessity is a harsh but effective teacher. By the time the Vikings reached Wessex in 871, the last remaining independent Saxon kingdom, they faced a force that had learned from the failures of its northern neighbors. Under the leadership of King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, the West Saxons had modified their tactics to counter the Viking shield techniques. Alfred, who would later earn the epithet the Great, had studied warfare extensively and recognized the need for innovation. He is recorded as having personally led his warriors in training, emphasizing the new shield techniques adapted from Viking methods. Under his influence, the West Saxon forces became more flexible and responsive, better able to counter the Norse advantages that had proven so devastating in earlier conflicts. The Chronicle describes numerous battles fought that year, with victories and defeats on both sides. The Saxon warriors had begun to adopt elements of Viking shield work, learning to parry and counter-strike, rather than simply absorb blows. They developed methods to disrupt the coordination of Viking shield movements, targeting the edges of their formations, where the system was most vulnerable. One innovation attributed to Alfred was the rotation of forces during prolonged engagements. Recognizing that the active shield techniques of the Vikings required greater energy and concentration than traditional Saxon methods, he would cycle fresh troops to the front lines while allowing tired warriors to recover at the rear. This approach neutralized one of the key advantages of the Norse fighting style, its effectiveness against opponents who became fatigued or predictable. The transformation of warfare wasn't limited to the battlefield. The very social structures that supported military action began to change as well. Alfred the Great, who succeeded his brother as king that same year, recognized that the old system of raising forces, calling up the fyrd or local militia when threats arose, was insufficient against opponents who could strike without warning. During his reign, he would institute a system of burhs, fortified settlements strategically placed throughout Wessex, each maintained by the surrounding countryside and garrisoned by trained warriors familiar with Viking fighting methods. The burh system represented a fundamental rethinking of Anglo-Saxon defensive strategy. Rather than attempting to meet Viking raiders at the point of incursion, which had proven largely ineffective, Given the speed and unpredictability of Norse movements, Alfred created a network of fortified positions that could provide refuge for the local population and serve as bases for counterattacks. Each burh was positioned so that no settlement in Wessex was more than a day's travel from a secure stronghold. These burhs were not merely military installations, but functioning settlements with markets, craftsmen, and religious institutions. They became centers for the dissemination of the new fighting techniques with regular training sessions for the local fyrd. The warriors stationed there studied and practiced the shield methods that had been adapted from Viking approaches, becoming increasingly proficient in the active, dynamic defense that had once been exclusively Norse. The evolution of shield techniques and the counters to them can be traced through archaeological findings across England. Early Viking Age battlefield sites show evidence of Saxon spearheads broken against shield bosses or deflected into the ground. Later sites reveal adaptations: spearheads designed to puncture or hook shields, axes weighted to deliver more force against parrying shields, and changes in shield construction on both sides. The material remains of this military evolution tell a story of continuous adaptation and counter-adaptation. Viking shields from the later 9th century show evidence of reinforcement around the edges, likely in response to Saxon tactics targeting this vulnerable area. Some examples display additional metal fittings or thicker rawhide edging. Saxon shields, meanwhile, began to incorporate elements of Norse design, becoming somewhat lighter and more maneuverable while retaining their traditional shape. Weapon finds from this period reveal similar patterns of adaptation. Viking swords, initially designed for cutting and slashing, began to feature stronger points for thrusting against opponents who had learned to parry cutting attacks. Saxon spears evolved to include barbs or hooks that could catch the edge of a shield and pull it aside. Both sides developed techniques for using the butt end of spears as improvised weapons in close combat, where shields had negated the primary point. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from burial sites. Viking warriors were often interred with their shields, allowing archaeologists to study their construction in detail. The shield boss, that central metal dome, evolved over time, becoming stronger and more prominent as it was increasingly used as an offensive weapon in its own right. The wooden components of shields rarely survive, but their metal fittings tell a story of constant refinement and adaptation. The Gokstad ship burial in Norway, dating from around 890, contained the remains of a warrior interred with his full equipment, including a round shield. Although the wooden components had largely decomposed, the metal fittings remained, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct its original form. The shield boss was substantial, capable of delivering a devastating strike when used offensively. The rim was reinforced with iron, providing both structural strength and a potential catching point for enemy weapons. Comparable Anglo-Saxon graves from the same period show shields that had begun to incorporate similar features while retaining their traditional form. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, though predating the Viking Age, provides a baseline for understanding how Anglo-Saxon shield design evolved in response to Norse influence. Later examples show a trend toward more manageable weight and reinforced edges, adaptations clearly influenced by experience against Viking fighting methods. The sagas and chronicles that record these conflicts often focus on the leaders and the outcomes rather than the mechanics of combat. But occasionally we get glimpses of how these shield techniques were viewed by contemporaries. The Anglo-Saxon poem The Battle of Maldon, which recounts a conflict in 991, describes how the Viking warriors raised their linden shields and advanced in formation. It speaks of shields being cloven and warriors falling as lines met. Though written well after the events of the Great Heathen Army, it preserves something of how these battles were perceived and remembered. This poem, composed shortly after the battle it describes, captures something of the respect that had developed between Saxon and Norse warriors after centuries of conflict. It portrays both sides as skilled and courageous, suggesting that by the late 10th century, the initial shock of Viking fighting methods had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding. The Saxon warriors at Malden are depicted using shield techniques that would have seemed foreign to their ancestors, but had become standard by this time. From the Norse perspective, the sagas of the Icelanders, though recorded centuries later, contain detailed descriptions of shield techniques. They speak of shield maidens skilled in the art of combat, of heroes who could catch spears on their shields and immediately return them to their senders, of duels fought according to strict rules where the shield played a central role. While we must be cautious about taking these accounts literally, they preserve cultural memories of the importance of shield work in Norse combat. Egil's saga, composed in the 13th century but set in the Viking Age, describes its protagonist as particularly skilled with the shield. In one notable passage, Egil is described catching javelins on his shield during a battle and immediately throwing them back at his attackers. While likely exaggerated for literary effect, this account reflects the Norse ideal of the shield as an active component of warfare rather than merely protective equipment. The cultural significance of shields extended beyond the battlefield. In Norse society, the giving of a shield could symbolize the offering of protection and allegiance. Kings would gift elaborately decorated shields to their most valued warriors, both as practical equipment and as visible symbols of the bond between lord and retainer. The designs painted on shields could identify a warrior's allegiance, family connections, or personal accomplishments, serving as an early form of heraldry. As the seasons turned and years passed, the conflict between Saxon and Viking entered a new phase. Alfred the Great, having secured Wessex through military and social reforms, began the process of reclaiming lands lost to the Norse invaders. His successors would continue this work, eventually establishing English control over much of the island. But the England that emerged from this crucible was not the same as the one that had existed before. Alfred's daughter Ethelfled, known as the Lady of the Mercians, played a significant role in this reconquest. Ruling Mercia after the death of her husband, she led campaigns against Viking-held territories and established new burhs to secure reconquered lands. Contemporary accounts describe her as personally directing military operations, a female leader in a male-dominated field who understood the shield techniques and counter-techniques that had evolved from decades of conflict. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, continued his father's work, extending West Saxon control northward into the Danelaw, those regions of England under Norse rule and law. His son Ethelstan would go further still, defeating a coalition of Viking, Scottish, and Strathclyde British forces at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a victory celebrated in an Anglo-Saxon poem preserved in the Chronicle. By this time, the military forces of Wessex had fully integrated the lessons learned from Viking shield techniques, creating a synthesis of Saxon and Norse approaches that proved highly effective. The integration of Viking settlers, particularly in the region known as the Danelaw, brought about cultural exchange beyond merely military techniques. Place names, legal concepts, linguistic elements all bear witness to Norse influence. And in matters of warfare, the synthesis of Viking and Saxon methods created something new and formidable. The Danelaw itself represented a kind of compromise between the cultures. Established by treaty between Alfred and the Viking leader Guthrum after the West Saxon victory at Edington in 878, it recognized Norse control over much of eastern and northern England, while establishing boundaries and relationships with the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Within this region, Norse legal concepts and social structures took root alongside existing Anglo-Saxon institutions, creating a hybrid culture reflected in everything from place names to burial practices. By the early 10th century, English armies had incorporated many elements of Viking shield techniques. The chronicles describe forces that could fight in the traditional shield wall when necessary, but could also operate with more flexibility and individual initiative. English shields became lighter and more maneuverable, though they never fully adopted the round Norse design, instead developing the kite shield that would become prominent in the late Viking Age and early medieval period. The kite shield represented an interesting synthesis of Saxon and Viking design principles. Retaining the larger coverage area of traditional Anglo-Saxon shields, it adopted a more tapered shape that reduced weight and improved maneuverability. The pointed lower end was particularly useful for mounted combat, protecting the rider's left leg while allowing freedom of movement. Though not directly derived from the Viking round shield, it reflected the lessons learned from encounters with Norse fighting methods, the importance of active shield use, and the need for balance between protection and mobility. Training methods evolved alongside equipment. The Anglo-Saxon fired, originally a levy of freemen called up for specific campaigns, began to include more professional elements. These warriors trained regularly in the techniques that had been developed to counter Viking methods, including active shield use, coordinated formation changes, and individual combat skills. The result was a military force more adaptable and responsive than its predecessors, capable of meeting Norse raiders on equal terms. The Vikings themselves were changing too. As settlers rather than raiders, many adopted local customs and eventually Christianity. Their distinctive shield techniques became part of a broader military tradition. The descendants of those who had once shattered Saxon spears with their shields now fought alongside the descendants of those same Saxons against new waves of raiders and invaders. The process of cultural integration was complex and multifaceted. In some regions of the Danelaw, Norse customs and language remained dominant for generations. In others, Viking settlers quickly adopted Anglo-Saxon practices while retaining elements of their native culture. The result was not a simple replacement of one tradition with another, but the creation of something new that drew from both sources. This process is visible in the evolution of warfare within the Danelaw. Archaeological evidence suggests that the mixed Norse-Saxon populations of these regions developed their own variations of shield techniques, combining elements from both traditions. Burial goods from this period sometimes include shields with features of both cultures, the shape and size of Saxon designs, but the lighter construction and more prominent boss of Viking models. The final chapter of the Viking Age in England came with the conquest attempts of Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Signut the Great around the turn of the millennium. By then, the distinction between Saxon and Viking fighting styles had blurred considerably. When Cnut took the English throne in 1016, his army contained warriors trained in the shield techniques that had once been the exclusive domain of Norse raiders. Cnut's conquest of England marked the culmination of centuries of interaction between Saxon and Viking cultures. Unlike earlier Norse leaders who had remained culturally distinct from the populations they ruled, Cnut embraced his role as an English king. He issued laws in Old English, patronized English churches, and governed through existing Anglo-Saxon institutions. His military forces reflected this same cultural synthesis, warriors of mixed heritage using fighting techniques derived from both traditions. Under Cnut's rule, England became part of a North Sea empire that included Denmark and Norway. This political unification created a context for further exchange of military techniques and technologies. Veterans of campaigns in Scandinavia brought their experience to England, while English warriors served in Cnut's continental forces. The shield techniques that had evolved through centuries of conflict became part of a shared martial culture spanning the North Sea world. The legacy of the Viking shield and its impact on warfare extended far beyond England. Throughout Europe, wherever Norse warriors ventured, they brought their distinctive fighting style. From the rivers of Russia to the Mediterranean, from Ireland to Iceland, the active use of the shield as both defense and offense influenced local military traditions. In Ireland, where Viking settlements like Dublin became important centers of trade and culture, the interaction between Norse and Irish fighting styles produced its own synthesis. Irish warriors, traditionally known for their mobility and individual combat skills, adopted elements of Viking shield techniques while retaining their preference for lighter equipment and fluid formations. The result was a distinctive approach to warfare that would influence military development in the region for centuries. In the Baltic, Norse expeditions brought their shield techniques into contact with Finnish, Baltic, and Slavic fighting traditions. Archaeological evidence from this region shows a gradual adoption of Viking-style shields and associated combat methods, particularly among coastal populations most exposed to Norse influence. By the late 10th century, warriors throughout the Baltic region were using variants of the techniques that had first appeared in Scandinavia. In Normandy, settled by Vikings under Rollo in the early 10th century, these techniques would be integrated with Frankish cavalry tactics to create the formidable Norman fighting style that would later conquer England in 1066. The Norman knights who rode at Hastings were the inheritors of both Viking shieldwork and Frankish horsemanship, a deadly combination that would help them overcome the Anglo-Saxon forces of King Harold II. The Norman conquest represents an interesting coda to the story of Viking shield techniques in England. William the Conqueror, himself the descendant of Norse settlers, led an army that included elements of both Scandinavian and Frankish military traditions. The shield techniques used by his forces were descendants of those that had first appeared on English shores nearly 3 centuries earlier, now returning in modified form as part of a new wave of conquest. The Battle of Hastings, as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, shows Norman knights using kite shields in ways that reflect both their Viking heritage and the demands of mounted combat. The active parrying and counter-striking that had characterized Norse shieldwork was adapted for use on horseback, with the shield positioned to protect the rider's left side while leaving the right arm free for offensive action. The Anglo-Saxon forces, using similar shields but fighting primarily on foot, employed their own adaptations of these techniques. The physical evidence of this exchange and evolution can be seen in the artwork of the period. The Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest, shows warriors with kite-shaped shields that represent the evolution of shield design from the round Viking shields to something more suitable for mounted combat, while retaining the maneuverability needed for active parrying and shield binds. The tapestry's depiction of the Battle of Hastings includes several scenes showing shields being used in ways that would have been recognizable to Viking warriors of earlier centuries. Norman knights are shown actively parrying Saxon spears and axes, creating openings for counterattacks with lance or sword. Saxon warriors are portrayed using similar techniques on foot, evidence of the degree to which the once distinctive Norse approach had been integrated into general European fighting methods. Archaeological findings from across the Viking world reveal similar patterns of adaptation and exchange. In Dublin, a Viking longfort, or fortified harbor that became a permanent settlement, excavations have uncovered shields and weapons that show a blend of Norse and Irish influences. In Russia, where Swedish Vikings known as the Russ established trading posts and eventually gave their name to the country itself, shield designs incorporated local materials and aesthetic elements while maintaining the functional aspects of Norse shieldwork. The techniques that made Viking shields so effective did not disappear with the end of the Viking Age. They were preserved in martial traditions across Europe, particularly in regions with strong Norse influence. Medieval fighting manuals, though written centuries later, contained echoes of these ancient methods, the principles of parrying rather than simply blocking, of using the shield as part of an integrated system of offense and defense, of manipulating an opponent's weapon to create openings. The transition from round to kite-shaped shields in the 11th century did not represent an abandonment of these principles, but their adaptation to new contexts. The kite shield, with its extended coverage of the left side of the body, was particularly well suited for mounted combat, but it retained the central grip behind a prominent boss that had characterized the Viking round shield, allowing for many of the same parrying techniques that had proven so effective in earlier periods. As plate armor became more common in the later medieval period, shields gradually became less central to European fighting styles. But the principles of active defense, of parrying rather than merely blocking, remained fundamental to martial traditions throughout the continent. Even as the shield itself evolved and eventually diminished in importance, the lessons learned from centuries of development, beginning with Viking innovations, continued to influence European approaches to combat. In Iceland, where many Norse settlers established homesteads in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the sagas preserved detailed accounts of shield techniques. These texts describe not just the use of shields in battle, but also in holmgang, a ritualized form of duel used to settle disputes. The rules of holmgang specified the size and construction of shields, how they were to be held, and even how many shields a combatant was allowed to use during the duel. The Icelandic sagas, though composed centuries after the events they describe, preserve valuable information about Viking shield techniques. They speak of warriors who could catch spears on their shields and immediately return them, of shield maidens who fought with the skill of any man, of heroes who could penetrate an opponent's defense with carefully timed strikes that circumvented their shield. While we must approach these accounts with caution, they offer insights into how Norse society remembered and celebrated the shield skills that had been so central to their military success. Modern experimental archaeology and historical martial arts reconstruction have given us new insights into how these shields were actually used. Practitioners have discovered that the techniques described in sagas and implied in archaeological findings are indeed effective. The Viking round shield, with its central grip behind the boss, allows for a remarkable range of motion and control. The edge binding of rawhide or iron not only strengthened the shield but allowed it to catch and trap the edges of weapons. These reconstructions have demonstrated the effectiveness of techniques described in historical sources. The ability to actively parry with the shield, redirecting an opponent's weapon rather than merely blocking it, creates opportunities for counterattacks that would not otherwise exist. The use of the shield boss as an offensive weapon, striking an opponent's face or body when an opening appears, can be devastating in close combat. The coordination of shield and weapon, moving as a unified system rather than as separate elements, multiplies the effectiveness of both. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Viking shield techniques was the mindset they represented. The shield was not seen as merely passive protection, but as an active tool in the combatant's arsenal. This fundamental shift in perspective transformed how battles were fought across Europe. This conceptual innovation, the idea that defense could be active rather than passive, represents one of the most important military developments of the early medieval period. It changed not just how shields were used, but how warriors thought about combat itself. Rather than standing firm and enduring an opponent's attacks, they learned to redirect those attacks, to create opportunities from threats, to transform defense into offense in a single fluid movement. The cultural impact of the shield in Viking society extended beyond warfare. Shields were symbols of status and protection, given as gifts to cement alliances, displayed prominently in halls, and eventually placed on the graves of warriors. In the Norse cosmology, the sky itself was conceived of as a shield held up by four dwarves, and one of Odin's names was Hrafnagud, god of the shield. Shields appeared prominently in Norse art and decoration, from the picture stones of Gotland to the wood carvings of stave churches. They were depicted in the hands of gods and heroes, symbols of divine protection and martial prowess. The circular form of the Viking shield influenced decorative motifs throughout Scandinavian art, appearing in jewelry, textile patterns, and architectural elements. In poetry and song, the shield served as a powerful metaphor. Skaldic verse, the complex formal poetry composed at Norse courts, made extensive use of shield imagery in its elaborate kennings, metaphorical phrases used to describe people, objects, and concepts. A warrior might be called a wielder of the stormboard, stormboard being a kenning for shield. A battle described as a meeting of shields, a protective leader referred to as a shield of his people. For the people who lived through this tumultuous period, the changes in warfare brought about by Viking shield techniques were a matter of life and death. For Saxon defenders facing Viking raiders, the failure to adapt meant defeat and subjugation. For Norse warriors venturing into hostile territories, the advantage their shield techniques provided meant the difference between returning home with wealth or not returning at all. The human cost of this military evolution is difficult to calculate, but was certainly substantial. Chronicles record thousands of deaths in major engagements, with countless more in smaller skirmishes and raids that went unrecorded. Behind each death was a life with its own story, its own network of relationships, its own hopes and fears. The shield techniques we analyze as historical developments were, for those who wielded them, desperate attempts to survive one more battle, to protect one more settlement, to return to one more homecoming. As we look back across the centuries that separate us from these events, it's important to remember that behind the archaeological findings and historical accounts were real people facing real challenges. The clash of Viking shield against Saxon spear was not just a technical exchange, but a human drama played out in moments of extreme danger and courage. The England that emerged from the Viking Age was fundamentally transformed. The political landscape had been redrawn, with the foundation laid for a unified English kingdom rather than separate Saxon realms. The population was more diverse, with Norse settlers contributing to the genetic and cultural makeup of the region, and the military traditions had been forever altered by the exchange of techniques and technologies. The linguistic evidence of this transformation surrounds us still. Words of Norse origin pepper modern English, from sky and egg to law and window, from husband and knife to die and take. Place names across northern and eastern England bear witness to Viking settlement, the Byes and Thorpes, the Thwaites and Tofts. These linguistic fossils remind us of a time when Saxon and Norse cultures met, clashed, and ultimately merged. The DNA of the modern English population tells a similar story. Recent genetic studies have identified substantial Scandinavian contributions to the genetic makeup of populations in areas historically part of the Danelaw. This biological legacy parallels the cultural one, a reminder that the warriors who once faced each other across shield walls eventually became neighbors, trading partners, and family members. In the centuries that followed, as feudal systems developed and armored knights became the dominant force on European battlefields, the principles of active shield use pioneered by Viking warriors remained relevant. The kite shields and later the heater shields of medieval knights were used with techniques that would have been familiar to Norse warriors, though adapted for mounted combat. Medieval martial arts manuals, such as the 13th century I-33 manuscript, describe sophisticated shield techniques that show clear continuity with the principles developed during the Viking Age. Though the specific forms and equipment had evolved, the fundamental concept of the shield as an active component of both defense and offense remained central to European fighting systems. As plate armor became more comprehensive and effective, the importance of shields in warfare gradually diminished. By the late medieval period, many knights had abandoned shields entirely, relying on their armor for protection and keeping both hands free for weapon use. But even as the shield itself receded in prominence, the principles of active defense that had been pioneered with Viking shield techniques continued to influence European martial arts. Even today, more than 1,000 years after Viking shields first shattered Saxon spears, the principles they embodied continue to influence modern combat systems. The concept that defense should not be merely passive, but should create opportunities for counterattack is fundamental to many martial arts. The understanding that psychological impact can be as important as physical damage shapes modern military thinking. Contemporary martial artists studying historical European fighting techniques have rediscovered the effectiveness of active shield use. Practitioners of historical martial arts reconstruction have found that the methods described in medieval sources and implied in earlier accounts are practical and powerful, offering insights into combat dynamics that remain relevant despite the vast changes in warfare since the Viking Age. Beyond specific techniques, the Viking approach to shield work represents a broader lesson about innovation and adaptation. The Norse warriors who developed these methods were responding to the challenges of their time with creativity and pragmatism. They took an existing technology, the shield, and reimagined its potential, transforming it from a passive barrier into an active component of offense and defense. This kind of innovative thinking transcends its specific historical context, offering inspiration for problem-solving in any era. As we walk the landscapes where these battles took place, the shorelines where longships beached, the fields where shield walls clashed, the settlements where cultures merged, we can almost hear the echo of shield against spear, the shouts of warriors, the commands of leaders. These echoes remind us that history is not a distant abstraction, but the story of people not so different from ourselves, facing challenges and finding solutions that would reshape their world and ours. The shields that once lined Viking longships are long gone, returned to the earth from which their wood was harvested. The hands that wielded them have been dust for centuries. But the impact of how those shields were used continues to ripple through time, a testament to how innovation on the battlefield, like innovation in any field, can have consequences far beyond its original context. In museums across Europe, the surviving shield bosses and metal fittings stand as silent witnesses to this revolution in warfare. Each dent and scratch tells a story of conflict and survival. And in the landscapes of England, the place names that still bear Norse influence, the settlements ending in by or thorp, the streets and fields with names derived from Old Norse, remind us of the people who brought their shields and their techniques across the North Sea to change the course of history. As our journey through this pivotal moment in medieval warfare comes to a close, we are left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of historical exchange. The meeting of Viking shield and Saxon spear was not simply a clash of opposing forces, but the beginning of a synthesis that would shape European warfare for centuries to come. It reminds us that even in conflict, cultures learn from one another, adapt, and evolve in ways that leave both forever changed. The story of how Viking shields shattered Saxon spears and changed battle forever is more than a tale of military technology. It is a chapter in the human story of innovation, adaptation, and resilience. And in understanding this distant past, perhaps we gain insight into our own capacity to face challenges, to learn from encounters with the unfamiliar, and to forge new paths forward, even in the most difficult circumstances. As the sun sets over the fields where shield walls once stood firm, we might imagine the ghost of a Viking warrior and a Saxon defender standing side by side, their descendants united in a land transformed by their encounter. The shields they carried have become the shields of history itself, protecting their memory and carrying their legacy forward into our time and beyond.